Thank you all. I'm going to start, Tim Orton from Aegon. Thank you. If I can start with you, setting goals, but actually putting them into action. What are we doing for implementation? And if you can share your insights into that, and then I will come round to my other panel members. Thank you.
Great, yeah, so Aegon, we've got the same sort of goals, targets as Royal London, so net zero by 2050 with 50% reduction by 2030. And I guess there's a range of actions that we've got going on. There's something about building foundations to start with. You know, as an industry, I think we need different capabilities to what we've had in the past. So that's about bringing in expertise, sustainability professionals, people who actually understand and think in a different way to how we perhaps thought before. There's something about data, which has been talked about already, and some of the complexities and measuring different things than we've measured before, about different companies, about different portfolios. There's governance, again, that's come up before. How are we making decisions? Where are we making decisions? The right sort of steering groups. We set up responsible investment steering groups that I chair in the UK and globally with members of our group executive. So there's a core consideration that perhaps wasn't there in the past. And collaboration as well, which again has come up already. The way I see it is, you know, getting to net zero is not a competitive sport in the industry. It's actually a social and environmental imperative, and need to work together to share best practice and get better solutions. So there's quite a lot of foundation building. In terms of action in portfolios, I think Faith mentioned fossil fuels. Now, and I'm reading in The Guardian, I think the value of fossil fuels predicted potentially to go to zero by 2036 or something. So actually, in terms of tail risk for investors, there's arguments for action around some of those things. So some of the things we've been doing is limiting exposures within some of our portfolios to some things like thermal coal, some of the more potentially harmful elements. And that has seen some reductions in intensity in our portfolios, carbon intensity in our portfolios today. But what we need also is a lot more innovative solutions. And there is an example that's profiled here at COP26, where we've worked with our own asset management company, Aegon Asset Management, around a sustainable bond fund. So it's snappily titled the Global Sustainable Sovereign Bond Fund. But what that effectively does is it aligns to Sustainable Development Goals. So we're looking at government debt and government borrowing and aligning the money that we have in the fund to those where we see governments making positive progress in their countries. So a more innovative solution, if you like, a more forward-looking solution around something that's a bit more goal-oriented as well. So a range of things from, I guess, building foundations to taking the action we can now. Excellent, and it's very positive because I think coming to this kind of event actually does feel very positive because it feels that these changes are going to be made. Eva, can I pass to you about your journey, Aberdeen's journey?
Yes, absolutely. So we're also members of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, and this year for us has really been about what does this mean in practice. We've set a target to decarbonise our assets 50% by 2030 in terms of carbon intensity, but also to increase the proportion of our assets that are really net zero 2050 aligned, work with our clients on that, and actually develop the solutions across all asset classes that are able to demonstrate that. And that's the key thing I wanted to kind of bring to life a little bit, because what we measure, what we include in the portfolio like that is, I think, really critical. So we use the Net Zero Investment Framework and have got 3 pillars generally that we think about. So firstly, how we decarbonise by investing in transition leaders. So the first thing is how we identify those transition leaders. And we try to incorporate a forward-looking view on carbon. So not just the carbon footprint today, but actually through our climate scenario analysis, understand what we expect the carbon pathway of those companies to be and how that compares to what is needed for net zero. So 7% every year, 50% by 2030. And then more actively looking at TPI scores, and transition pathway initiative assessments of the quality of the transition strategies, and actually our own active research into those companies and what they do, so that we can fill that transition leaders bucket. The second bucket is climate solutions. So those that actually help others decarbonise through their products and services. And generally we would use green revenues as a first point of identifying that list, but again, sometimes that just doesn't capture the full story. So we need to understand what do these companies do that maybe leads to avoided emissions in other avoids emissions in other areas, and have a really clear view on climate solutions. And actually, we have strategies that are just focused on climate solutions. And it's quite hard when we look at something like a temperature rating. It just doesn't capture it that well because it doesn't incorporate the impact of climate solutions into these methodologies. And then the third pillar is stewardship, and actually really dedicated to engaging individually with companies and collaboratively, and using, for example, the Climate Action 100+ Net Zero benchmark that has 10 indicators, and starting to set a clear baseline and identify, because every company, every region will have a different starting point, where do we expect them to improve and see progress against these milestones. And I think all of these things together then demonstrate that this is really about developing solutions that help decarbonize the real world and not just the portfolio.
Thank you. And coming, Faith, to yourself, we've touched on collaboration and we've touched on your role and with your excellent speech. I wonder just your observations on this collaborative approach that everyone is trying to take. We're working together, and clearly you've been out as a key driver from, for a long time, thinking through how that collaboration, what you're seeing in practice, and what more can we be doing when we're implementing, actually taking these key steps, say, how are we collaborating and are we doing it effectively?
No, you're absolutely, and one of the core elements of our strategy is obviously is collaboration, both at sort of a Brunel and sort of amplifying that more broadly, and that collaboration can happen at all sorts of different levels. I mean, our own policy around climate, we have been integrating it into our mandate design, but we made it more formal in 2020 that, to make it very clear to the asset managers that we were employing that they needed to be on this journey, they needed to take the steps within their portfolios. So there was a sort of a threat around the fact that, if you didn't align, if you didn't support in this ambition, that we would probably part company, but more in a more positive collaborative way. It was about, we'll work in partnership, and we've got some excellent examples of working with our managers on their mandates, bringing in factors into kind of quant funds and things like that, and bringing climate change into the first time to some of these managers, and seeing how they can actually then deliver decarbonisation within that. And those collaborations are really exciting because they don't just change your mandate, they tend to take that work and amplify it and go, oh right, this is something we can do more broadly. So that's at a very practical level, if you like, from Brunel's perspective and working with asset managers. But those collaborations work with other asset owners, with asset managers. I've touched on the collaboration around the Paris Aligned Investor Initiative, which was very much, Eva worked, loads of people, many people in this room worked on that initiative in different work streams together to work through practical methodologies to really help each other in taking that work forward. So I think that, and we've touched on Climate Action 100+, which is probably the collaboration. It is the largest collaboration with investors ever. It is on climate change, and it is bringing around action. I think we've trying to remember the numbers now. It's something like about over 2/3, I think, of companies under that programme, or over 2/3 of those companies under that programme of work, have made a net zero commitment of some form. So I know there's often some pushback on stewardship and pushback, does it actually make a difference? I think we're genuinely seeing a difference from the corporates. The corporates are saying this is in our interest too. We just need to know what we're being asked for, and again, to collaborate with them and be quite clear to the company in those expectations. Finally, I will say collaboration is the other thing we're doing, or encouraging those companies to do across their value chain, which again I think was touched on by David, understanding the fact that the aviation industry has to work with the oil and gas industry and the infrastructure. There's a whole kind of chain of these demand and supply, and I think encouraging those companies through our own stewardship to actually collaborate themselves outside of their sectors, I think as well. So it's happening all over, so I think that's something to be really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we stay on that, I appreciate there are challenges as we move forward, and we come back to some of the challenges. But if we look at some of the opportunities that are available, you mentioned innovation, earlier, Tim. There is a lot happening, and we've heard from Ivan earlier. Can we touch on your observations on innovation and opportunities? You know, I feel this is something where we're on a positive note. Let's stay on that one. We'll come back to some of the challenges.
Yeah, I think for me it's around meaningful outcomes and trying to align as far as possible to particular goals. And that as well has a side benefit of making it more meaningful to pension scheme members, gets them more engaged, and maybe help them feel more satisfied with that they're actually using their pension fund in a positive way. So be it around SEG alignment, around temperature alignment, be it around biodiversity. You know, there could be all sorts of positive impacts that we're aiming for in different fund components, and trying to get them to a scale where they are accessible in a DC market rather than just purely in a sort of an institutional infrastructure type space.
Thank you. Eva, can I pass that along to you?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, as I said earlier, you know, these buckets we're trying to fill for net zero solutions, we need to have a clear process for identifying those opportunities, and you know, active research is a key part of that. But one of the things I was going to highlight is the way we try to bring a forward-looking view into this through climate scenario analysis. So we've done that quite extensively over the last couple of years, partnering with Planetrix, looking at 14 different scenarios from 1.5 to over 3 degrees aligned, and then identifying the impact on asset values today from these scenarios. And so when we look at one that is an energy transition, a Paris-aligned energy transition scenario that's happening, what it shows us is we look at a sector, and within that sector we can really see a dispersion of impacts. Utilities was the strongest dispersion, actually. We could see a big group of utilities positively impacted in the energy transition because they're well positioned for renewable energies, and a big proportion negatively impacted. And that was a great starting point as input, not the ultimate just only point to use in the decision making, but as input to identify winners and losers of the energy transition and investment opportunities. So we would take that as input, and also then, as I say, complement that with more active research on what do these companies actually do in terms of their strategies, you know, and I talked about climate solutions, and just kind of bring that together. But one final point I was going to make is to understand that I think there are lots of opportunities in terms of the energy transition, but for net zero 2050, it is that kind of pace that we need that needs to be, you know, really, really stringent. And when we look at the results of our climate scenario analysis, we also apply probabilities to understand what path are we actually on. And last year when we did it, it was a 2.4 degree path, and this year it was a 2.2 degree path, so it's getting closer, which is good news. But it's not Paris aligned yet, and so ultimately, if you think about it from a kind of market and economics perspective, you know, those opportunities will align with that path rather with the net zero 2050 that we want in the longer term. So we do need those policies to really strengthen, particularly to provide opportunities in the hard to abate sectors. We need cement, we need steel, we need innovation and technologies that sometimes just need, and I've heard this this week, I was at some great Scottish innovation sessions around tidal energy and carbon capture and storage, and they do end with the message that we need higher carbon prices to really make this financially viable. So I think that is where a lot of opportunities will come down the line in innovation when we see policies and carbon prices increasing as well.
Yeah, and it's that bit about they need capital, don't they? They need investment if we're actually going to have things that are innovative and that will lead to a change. So Faith, if I can take that one over to you and your thoughts on that as well, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so another one, we have like five parts of our 5-point plan, as it were, for our climate policy, and one of them is positive impact. And using that sort of theme that we can identify through the investment opportunities that are either within the listed or the private market space. It'd be fair to say we find it easier in the private market space right now, just because you tend to be able to see it, although the reporting is going to be one of the challenges from there. One of the examples that we've used extensively, it's actually, there's quite a good YouTube clip on the FT, which covers a greenhouse that we invested in, and we that has massively reduced the carbon footprint of the production of tomatoes. It's using waste heat from a sewerage plant. It also created hundreds of jobs. And I think that's one of the things also we talk about sort of the climate impacts and the positive impacts there. But if the research has shown that if the UK government implemented the Climate Commission's findings, the Committee on Climate Commission's findings, they reckon it will create maybe up to 1.7 million jobs, maybe even up to 2 million could be, and that's just in the UK. And the IEA's report from its roadmap to net zero identified like a net of about 14 million jobs. So I think just seeing, I mean, and jobs we have to recognise, particularly with sort of the levelling up and all of that sort of agenda, that sort of social impacts alongside the climate is absolutely critically important, and the work that I think many of us are involved in around what we call the just transition and making sure it's socially inclusive. So if you can get these win-wins, creating what they call green collar jobs, at the same time as reducing your carbon impacts, that's just amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's very important. The other bit for me, and we've touched on this in the other sessions, it's the communication. And, you know, if we think about it, all of us are well used to the frameworks, the measurements, you know, the different references. But if you are an ultimate investor or somebody in a DC scheme, or you're the member of a final salary scheme and you've got questions on climate, I come at this from a legal point of view, and I apologise to the other lawyers in the room, but I do think there's a lot of the legal stringency or regulatory piece around communications, where you actually then look at communication at the end, and there's some real challenges. And I think Barry talked about the kind of the way of trying to engage with members, and it's one of my big bugbears. So I'd welcome all of your thoughts. How are we going to distill this down to what action is being taken through pension schemes, and how are we going to get that message out and in a really clear, succinct way so that people understand, and they also understand the just transition. So I think guiding people through that is going to be absolutely vital. So Tim, can I come to you first on that one, please?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the start point is that most pension scheme members, DC scheme members, end up in the default fund, and the kind of the word default means they're not really actively choosing. They're just selecting the central obvious thing. So we're starting from a position where there's maybe limited thought from you know, a large number of members, and just trying to build some basic understanding that your pension money is actually investing in things, and it's real. And then there's a bit more around actually what are those things, and are they positive things? Do they match into the sort of the outcomes that we want to see in the world and they may be interested in the world? So there's really some building up of some sort of interest level, if you like, that I think we can do. And then we can build on that in terms of actually what are the choices then, and what can you do as a member to you know, make a positive choice, if you like, about how and where you invest and what outcomes you're trying to achieve with that. So there's plenty we can do, building up from simple foundations to build more understanding of actually what your pension is, and what impact it can have, and then how you can act on that.
Super, thank you. Eva,
I think that is a real challenge, I think, for the industry, and to be able to just distill that into something very simple. David on the panel earlier talked about temperature metrics, and this is also something we feel quite strongly about, having tried them, that sometimes they just don't tell the full story. So there's been a drive in the industry over the last year to you know, have a solution for how we measure portfolio alignment. Is this portfolio aligned with net zero 2050? And ideally you would just put a temperature number on it to say it's aligned with the 1.8 or 2.2 world. But you look at the detail of how this is done, and as I mentioned, some of the climate solutions are just not captured in there, or some of the transition leaders. So we looked a little bit at some of the providers, and they all provide a different temperature score. That's the first problem. But you want to invest maybe in a leading cement company to help the transition, and a company like Heidelberg Cement is 4-degree aligned. But they have a science-based targets, and you might see that, you know, in a difficult to decarbonize industry. So this is the real challenge. So if you just use that 4-degree number, it really doesn't tell you the full story. but do you have time to tell the full story? Ideally, from my perspective, it would be maybe an overarching message around something being aligned with net zero investing principles, and then maybe a dashboard that shows a bit about carbon backward and forward looking, a bit about the proportion of maybe assets in that portfolio that are seen as transition leaders or have a high TPI score, something like that, the green revenues, and then maybe the engagement, so that you actually can bring it to life a little bit behind the just simple headline, because it can really mask some of the challenges. And I think this is really something that we need to evolve in the industry, so that we can tell the story of real-world decarbonisation impact in a simple way.
Yeah, thank you. Faith, can I pass that to
So
you?
very briefly, I'd say that I think this has taken quite a step change with the FRC's Stewardship Code, because that's basically said that if, and I know it's still voluntary, but very sort of encourage people to use that as a practical framework. It's very, very demanding, but it also then provides that structure in terms of thinking about systemic risk, prioritisation, evidencing your engagement, evidencing what worked but also what didn't work and why, and recognising those areas for change. So it is very demanding, but I think it's provided us with that framework as to what good disclosure looks like. What I would say is one of our focuses when we were writing it was to write it that it was interesting and for the beneficiaries. So that was who we wrote it for, and then sort of work backwards to make sure that it also ticked all the regulators' boxes as to what they wanted to see. But we sort of worked backwards, and we certainly had some quite interesting discussions internally going, so because you were, unlike perhaps a normal or a traditional responsible investment or sustainability report, it's a little bit more warts and all. People go, why are you saying this and why are you saying that? No, we were required to say what didn't work, or this didn't work, and or this was a failed engagement with this company and the action that you took. So it's probably a bit uncomfortable territory, I'd say at first, but I think people recognise that. I think it will build trust by having a slightly more kind of honest type of reporting that comes through following that framework.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think people want authenticity, don't they? They want something that feels real. Thank you. I'm going to open, I think we've still got some time, so I'm going to throw the floor open for questions. Could I take this first gentleman down here at the front, please? Thank you. If you wouldn't mind saying your name and to whom you're addressing the question, if it's to the whole panel, that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Clark, our advisory. It's a question of the full panel. And I'd like to pick up your innovation point, which I think is a really, really key one, and bring it to the sort of engage versus divest issue, which is sort of rather boring and rather futile. Leading investors have now seen that the next stage of that is engaging on the equity and actually reducing the capital to debt. So it's become more sophisticated. We need that continuous conversation with the company through the equity. But we've seen the Bank of England on the corporate bond purchase scheme beginning to tilt that away from fossil fuels. We've seen a central bank not holding some state bonds from Australia and Canada. I was working the other day with an investor who was beginning to put into an IMA some capex conditions so that if the capex of this company wasn't satisfactory, they were out the investable universe. So I'd just like to ask the panel, how are the investors accelerating the sort of less capital for bonds, because that is the way that we will encourage corporates who are currently sort of hesitant, will they make it, will they not make it? But I think one of the key things will be reducing the stock of bond capital to accelerate the transition in the real economy. So I'd just be interested in the panel's comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm happy to comment briefly, and we haven't differentiated in that way, in terms of deny your debt and engage your capital, which I know some is kind of getting that traction in the industry. But what we're doing is much more clearly defining, looking at the highest financed emitters, and that's across equities and credit. And then setting those milestones, as I was saying earlier. And actually, we've now very specifically said that we're going to start a program that provides the transparency on these milestones and looks for 2 years to see progress. And if the progress is not sufficient, to have a step to divest from those companies, so that there's a time-bound, really clear milestones that are time-bound, and also consequences. And I do think the industry needs to be better at demonstrating that there are consequences when engagement is not successful. So that's the path we're taking now.
Thank Thank you, Tim. Did you want to?
I guess just probably in a more general sense in the question, but I think that the whole stewardship industry that has grown up is important around how we are encouraging change in the underlying funds that we use as pension scheme provider, and also the underlying companies that are within the different funds that are part of our portfolios. And there's some combination of, there has to be something at the end of the process. So a combination of actually action that sits behind, and there's a recognition that if that stewardship doesn't lead to the right outcomes, then action will ensue, and sometimes real action now really focuses the mind. So I just believe there's a balance of the two.
Thank you. Faith, did you want to come in?
Yeah, no, conceptually, I think it's a very strong idea. I mean, the debt is such a more powerful way in terms of what they're actually doing in terms of the financing, and it is that access to capital, I think, can have much. It's sort of very time specific, but quite a pinch point, if you like, for those companies. So you certainly get their attention if you're sort of qualifying your commitment to refinance their debt, unless you see that sort of long-term alignment. The challenge we have at the moment is the fact that there's probably an inadequate number of investors who are thinking this way. So at the moment, the debt market is so kind of flush with money that even if quite a lot of us decide to deny the debt, it's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference at the moment. So we do need this to build momentum if it's going to have the impact we desire. But I think conceptually we've got to look at what is the right solution, or the right ways to engage with different assets. Is it do we put in covenants in some of the sort of debt arrangements? Do we put in, then is obviously engagement, stewardship, voting? What do we do in terms of conditions? Like, do we with our private markets, do we make some of the carry contingent on certain outcomes and things like that? So there's all looking at each asset class and working out where the kind of where you can exercise influence and maximising those. So I think the fact that we need to think about it differently is absolutely valid.
Super, thank you all. Can I open for, I think I could maybe take 2 questions if the panel's comfortable. We'll take 2 at a time. Thank you. And then if we can come to this gentleman or person down the front, thank you.
Thank you, Willemijn Verdegel, Ortec Finance, and thank you very much for organising this session. I was interested in some of the messaging that there's talk about ambitious targets, reducing fossil fuels to 0 by 2036, if I heard that correctly. At the same time, it's about not falling off a cliff edge, but reducing fossil fuels to 0 in 2036, if you think even about that, what that means technologically is, diving off a cliff edge if there was no other. So I find it quite interesting, this kind of contradictory messaging, and how the panel is thinking about reconciling those 2 ideas and thinking about systemic risk, tail risk, and how that actually ties together. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take the second question before I turn to the panel. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sophia. I'm with Tesco Pension Investment. So I had a question particularly for Eva. But you're welcome to touch on it, around climate solutions. So how you define climate solutions, whether you follow more of a taxonomy approach or a qualitative case-by-case assessment, and particularly when you go beyond green bonds, or so in equity or green revenues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I take that one first?
Absolutely. If you want to go with that one first, and then we'll come back to the cliff edge. Thank you.
So the starting point is green revenues, aligned with the EU taxonomy. As I say, sometimes that just doesn't tell you the full story. When we think about our Climate Solutions Fund, then we also look at a combination, multi-asset, looking at green infrastructure and green bonds as well. But for a corporate, we would look at the green revenues, and we would also then try to look at, actually through that active research I mentioned earlier, what they're actually doing through their products and services. Some of our fund managers and analysts have started to look at calculating avoided emissions, so scope 4, and that is something that we just don't have that readily available in the industry yet. And the idea is not to just deduct it from your carbon footprint, but to get an idea of actually what is the impact on greenhouse gas emission reductions of these solutions, and to be able to try and calculate that, because we've spoken to the data providers and it's just not there in terms of the maturity in the industry to be able to source that data. But we believe without it, it's really not telling you the full story. So a combination of trying to calculate the avoided emissions and the green revenues aligned with EU taxonomy.
Thank you, Eva. And then if Faith or Tim are in.
Should I go?
Feel free.
I
Thank you.
I think I made the comment. Yeah, I mean, I was reading my memory of a newspaper headline over the last couple of days, one of our national newspapers, and I guess the 2036 is 15 years from now. So the cliff, we've kind of got 15 years to get down it in using the dates, and I guess getting there, to get to net zero, we do have to cut back on some forms of energy. And I guess it's consistent with that over a period of time, the nature of the energy that is used evolves as it has been. And from an investment point of view, and as a pension scheme provider, I guess we've got to navigate how do we navigate our portfolios on that transition at the same time. And some of that goes back to action now to put our capital in the places where we want to support and not the places that we don't want to support. And some of that is into the stewardship and how do we encourage businesses to evolve their practices to be moving towards more positive impacts rather than harmful components. So I guess those are the different jigsaw pieces in play. So it isn't to say that headline of zero value in 2036 means an immediate wholesale shift in one direction, but it's a signal of the real potential consequence of the transition that we need to see and something that we therefore need to consider.
And just picking up on that point, I think it's we've got to recognise that not all fossil fuels are listed. So there's quite a lot of, in the system that's not necessarily with these listed entities in which we might have access. But we know that we need to decarbonise the energy system by 2040. In Europe, that's probably 2035. And that will make a big impact on this sort of fossil fuel reduction. And that's where the focus is to remove those fossil fuels from that energy production, if you like, and the energy systems. And I think that's the key area. For ourselves, I think the way we're managing it, one of the things that we've done is launched a benchmark. So talking about our passive, I know there was a comment about passive investment in the last panel, was that we have designed with FTSE Russell, using the EU regulations, a net zero, a Paris-aligned benchmark. And what that does is there are two. One is the Paris-aligned, they're not known as PAB. They're both Paris-aligned, so it's quite confusingly named. But that one has it does actually limit the fossil fuel exposure. It sort of takes them out in terms of the supply, and then there's the focus on the demand and reducing the sort of demand in terms of a footprint. In the climate transition benchmark, that still has fossil fuels in there, but it has it reduces it by 30% to start with and 7% per annum afterwards. So where we're seeing to use that is in the stewardship by engaging with those fossil fuel companies that unless they're transitioning, unless they're shifting their capex models away and pivoting away from fossil fuels, they will fall out of our investable universe. But it's a predictable forward sort of pathway, if you like. It's not tomorrow, it's sort of incrementally going down that way, and we think that that's quite a constructive way to kind of support these companies through the transition whilst keeping the pressure on us to the pace needed, which is aligned, and that 7% per annum is aligned with a no overshoot sort of scenario, so it is aligned with where we need to get to and when we need to get to it.
And actually it does feel then that the targets and the measures that we're taking over time will avoid a cliff edge, this kind of wholesale change.
I mean, as I said in my speech, the scale of what we're trying to achieve is just phenomenal. So I think we just need to recognise the fact we're talking about a societal and economic shift unlike anything we have ever experienced, ever. This is bigger, deeper, wider than the Industrial Revolution. So this is enormous. So it is going to be bumpy, it's going to be messy, we're going to make mistakes. So I think people need to recognise the fact that we've just got to get started, because the slower we are to start, the more messy and the more difficult it's going to be. But to think that this is going to be we've passed the point where the smooth transition, and we've missed that. This is going to be difficult and it's going to be messy, which comes back to your point about collaborating and working together to kind of solve these problems together. So it's not going to be smooth, unfortunately. There's no happy smile on that one, I'm afraid.
A shift in culture,
yes.
And then carbon. Yeah. If I can, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Alex Wilkes with the Sunrise Project. We work with a range of think tanks and campaign organisations in this area. I don't know what you all think. One of the announcement by ABP, one of the world's 5 largest pension funds, I think 10 days, 2 weeks or so ago, where in brief they agreed to sell out of the fossil fuel supply companies, citing difficulties in engaging in the way that they were hoping, and to engage very, very heavily on the demand side. I think that was interesting in itself, and apparently they were quite impressed by the IEA's report and the IPCC reports that have come through this year. And thinking that further forward, how fast do you believe that pension funds such as yours and others represented in this room are likely to lock on to the IEA's dates, and approaches, no new oil and gas expansion, the various gas and coal and other phase-out dates, and make those the centerpiece of their voting and engagement policies and of the new finance policies, new financing as referred to by the gentleman just ahead of me? Thank you.
Shall I start on that?
Thank you, please.
The pension funds. So, I mean, the answer is we are already doing that. So the answer is immediately. It all depends on your theory of change. Our perspective is that we will stay invested with these companies, but with some very clear defined time-bound solutions, as Eva outlined. We've already been and had a meeting with Shell where we said that, their continued exploration was not something they, at the time that we were talking to them, they still had plans to continue, I think, till 2025. And we said that really wasn't appropriate in terms of, the IEA was quite clear that current licensed oil fields, because we're not we are still an oil-based society in terms of most of how we function, so we have to acknowledge we still need it today, but we need to get it out of the system as rapidly as possible. So and we made that really clear. My CIO and myself and my head of stewardship on the call saying, no, this is the direction of travel. That's not a palatable part of your forward strategy, whereas some of the, obviously the other components. So we're building it in already. We're using things like those elements already sort of factored into kind of the sort of the management quality and carbon performance elements of TPI, and using that to vote against those companies where we feel that the plans aren't aligned. So I think BHP's plan recently again had quite a strong dissent because of the fact they looked to have continued exploration of coal, and the investor base was very vocal in pushing back on that. So I think you're seeing that already. So the answer is we would be stupid not to take any of the advice or research that comes and immediately see how you can apply it. I think what we've got is just that different pension funds will have different mechanism or different ways in which they will take that advice and want to bring about the same change. So I think our objectives are the same as APB's, we're just doing it slightly different. We think the way to get the outcome is slightly different.
Thank you. Can I come to Tim on that one from a provider perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, there's lots of different, I guess, targets and ideas out there that are sort of broadly heading in the same direction, but with different detail. I mean, ours are framed simply around, net zero by 2050, 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. So we're kind of driven towards that goal and setting plans out to achieve that. And that will, again, there'll be sort of consistent things, but there's a combination of, we start from the market, typically default funds start from the market, they start from the overall index that you've got in a particular country. That will hopefully get better from some of the stewardship type activities and the encouragement of companies. There's then some of the twisting away from some of the more harmful elements, if you like, in an index, and adding in some more impactful positive elements. And those are our simple tools, I guess, over time to achieve those. And I guess, as Faith had said, all of these other sort of reports and ideas that come along are just food for thought in how we try and reach those goals.
Thank you.
I can just add very briefly. I think I mentioned earlier around, the kind of stewardship approach being core to our approach, and I think demonstrating transparency of what that means is really important, and also implications. So to really think through about where you're divesting, we're a global asset manager, and what impact that could have across different regions that are very heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So we talked about the just transition, and that you cannot just say we're switching completely away from that. You might end up in a situation where you can't really invest in that region at all because the policies are not there yet to support that, and it's quite different from what we have in Europe and in the UK. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Super. Can I just thank all my panel members, and I'll hand back to Natalie. Thank you. Thank you all.